Hi, I'm Dr. Patty Ferris. I'm a board-certified dermatologist, and I'm your host for this episode of Skincare Confidential. Just as a reminder, Skincare Confidential is an extension of our medical meeting, the Science of Skincare Summit. The Science of Skincare Summit is going to be held in Austin, Texas, November the 8th through the 10th this year. This is our fourth year. Super excited about that. So if you're interested in learning even more about skincare than you hear on the podcast, check us out, scienceofskincaresummit.com. So today I'm really excited because I've got one of the most preeminent photobiologists in the country for sure, and probably the world with me, Dr. Joshua Williams. And I'm going to read his bio to you because it's oh so impressive. He's the manager and research fellow at Kenvue in global skin health research and development. And for those of you who don't know, Kenvue is the Johnson & Johnson consumers sort of rebranded name. We're all getting used to it. I'm still hard for me. He has 10 years of experience in product development and clinical evaluation, specifically interested in sunscreen because he's a photobiologist, but he also works with other skincare products as well. He's a translational photobiologist and brings expertise in physical chemistry and experimental design to the ever-changing landscape of sun care. The brands that he supports are Neostrata, Lubriderm, Aveeno, and Neutrogena, all brands that dermatologists totally love. He holds a Ph.D. in pharmaceutical science from the University of Arizona College of Pharmacy. Over his research career, he's had the privilege of working with numerous teams of physicians and scientists in areas of skin biology, topical drug delivery, and skin cancer prevention. So, Josh, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Super excited to have you here. And Josh and I had the pleasure of meeting and working on a project a couple of weeks ago, and that's what made me think that this would be such an interesting subject for Skincare Confidential. It's the summer. Dermatologists are in the thick of it with their patients, trying to get everybody to wear sunscreen and explain what the importance of sunscreen is. So I thought it would be fun, Josh, if we started off with those survey questions that were given to the Gen Zs, because this is a little bit disheartening if you're a dermatologist and probably disheartening if you're somebody who makes sun protection products as well. But we must have missed the boat with this generation. So some of the interesting survey factoids, I'll call them. 71% of those surveyed were unfamiliar with the risks associated with sunburn. 59% believe the tanning myths, as we call them, that a base tan is protective. 59%. That's kind of shocking to me. 37% said they would use sunscreen, but only if somebody nagged them. I guess that's their mother because these people are pretty young. 28% believe that getting a tan is more important than preventing skin cancer. Yikes. And then 30% of them say looking good now is worth it, even if I look worse later. I can only laugh because they have never experienced later, right? These are teenagers and young adults. So weigh in for just a minute on this survey and these survey results.
Yeah, we'll have to follow up with them when later comes and see what their opinion still is.
When they're getting Mohs surgeries and getting things burned off their face. It's so true.
Yeah. Even though it's tough, I mean, I still try to look at it with a glass kind of half full perspective, right? In the sense of there's still work to be done and opportunity to constantly educate in this space. And that's, what this survey to me is just a reminder of that, each successive generation, each crop of people needs to be re-educated in terms of what we're learning and what we continue to remind ourselves, right? The research hasn't uncovered new evidence over these years about the importance of protecting yourself and the role that photoprotection has in preventing skin cancer and skin aging. So, but none of us know that when we're born. So we just have to keep being reminded, and we just have to have that continuous cadence of education and that right messaging that resonates, because it's so easy to be lost.
It's really true. And as a dermatologist, we harp on it all day long, and it just, sometimes you feel like a broken record, but hopefully some of it starts getting through, penetrating in there. So we're going to talk
that
obviously.
Record. I say that record.
Exactly.
You're a broken record, but that record's still new to those new patients, right? Those
100%.
That new generation. 100%. So we still have to keep playing it.
I think we've done better with tanning beds now. I see that a little light in the end of the tunnel on that. I think people are less likely to do that than they were, when my kids were in high school, which is a long time ago, 20 years. they were all tanning. Everybody was in tanning beds. And I don't see as much of that now. Some of them have even changed their business model to spray tan, and which is
Hmm.
great. So we're making some progress, I think, there. I want to talk about obviously sun protection and sunscreens because you're such an incredible resource on that. And I think if we kind of kick it really basic to start, looking at the differences between the chemical and the mineral sunscreens, and what is the difference in the way that they actually impact UV light in terms of, I think we routinely think of one as being an absorber and one of being as a reflector, but I think that maybe is an oversimplification.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that again comes up all the time, and it's a source of lots of different aspects of confusion. So just chemical or organic or physical or inorganic or mineral,
Right,
those are the classes of actives that sunscreens use to be efficacious, right? To prevent UV
right,
light from hitting and damaging the skin. So the chemical or organic filters, even that name in itself is confusing to people in terms of it's just organic chemistry, right? Those are the molecules that absorb light. So they take the
exactly.
photons, they take them in, and they dissipate the energy before it hits your skin. The minerals are crystals, right? They're rocks. They're electron dense particulates that do the same thing. They prevent the electrons from hitting your skin, but they must be formulated in a completely different way. So in that sense, both can be used to make effective sunscreens, but the sunscreens that they can be used in can be very different from a solution of organic chemicals that works in, you know, pH and solvent to the minerals that have to be dispersed and optimally
Right,
stabilized. So there, lots of different formulation chemistry approaches to make them work, but in the end, they both are actives used to make effective sunscreen and sunscreen formulations that
right,
work essentially the same way. Chemicals absorb, the minerals absorb and scatter and reflect,
right.
and they have those different cosmetic properties. And so in the end, you can, this is why you get a huge array of different products with different feel and form, but in the end, they can all work very well to prevent the UV light from hitting your skin.
Absolutely. So we talk a lot now about the longer wavelengths of light, visible light and infrared or near infrared in particular. And of course, we know that they cause photoaging. They also cause hyperpigmentation, especially in the darker skin types. So just talking about how to best protect from that. But the question that I get asked, and that I still think it's not clear in my own mind, do mineral sunscreens protect at all against longer wavelengths of light out of the UV spectrum?
So yeah, this is a fascinating area. It's an evolving area of research. It's certainly relevant to people in different ways. So I understand why people have lots of questions in this
So
space.
the chemical sunscreens obviously are in the UV spectrum. They're not absorbing physical, I mean, absorbing visible light or infrared. Okay, so, but go ahead with about the mineral sunscreens.
Yeah, so mineral sunscreens can, right? In the essence that if you can see them on your skin, then they're impacting visible light, right? So they're
Correct.
affecting the way visible light interacts with your skin. So they're changing it. And the most often way you see it is that white or purplish cast of reflection. So they
Mm-hmm.
they are able to impact that part of the spectrum.
Okay.
What's necessary for each individual, what's necessary for each individual to achieve their desired outcomes. That's where the research is actively pursuing right now to figure that out.
Gotcha. And what about iron oxides and the tinted sunscreens? Because we always, as dermatologists, are told, you have to have iron oxides to protect against visible light.
Right. And that's where a lot of the clinical studies are, right? Where there's, a
Right.
formula with iron oxide that got a certain shade, was able to deliver, protective benefit against, some sun exacerbated conditions. So that's out there. And yeah, indeed, in the same way, right? The iron oxides tint the formula, they provide color, so they show you that they're working against visible
Ah,
light. They change the color on your skin, especially if you use them at a high enough concentration or high enough density on the skin. Again, the fascinating part is that just having iron oxide, is that enough? It's iron oxide is another ingredient that's not necessarily simple. It's a blend of different pigments with
pigments.
different shades, so it's more than just concentration that can drive the efficacy of that formula. So we often get asked similar questions in terms of, does your formula have 2% or 3% or 5% iron oxide? And you say, well, either the answer is no, but it's also, is that, what are you looking for in that formula? Is it just concentration? And again, active research in that area to figure out what's the right shade? What's the right blend? Is it
Right.
usable? How does it achieve the benefit people are looking for?
And aren't there different colors of iron oxides?
Yep, yellow, red, and black. So all
Right.
dependent on the oxidation status and the particulate size and shape. So all of that will blend together to ultimately provide formulation efficacy. So it's more than just ingredient presence. You have to look for how it's incorporated into the formulation, just like all other things in sun care. It's fascinatingly complicated.
Yeah, fascinatingly complicated. And talking about the mineral sunscreens again, in terms of, how do you make them aesthetically pleasing? Because we all remember and even know some products still in the marketplace that aren't that aesthetically pleasing. But it seems now that there's all these sort of disappearing mineral sunscreens, if I could call them that, where you put them on and then you can hardly see them. Are we losing efficacy with that, or
I mean,
are
I
they
hope not. I think
are
there's
they
some
still are they
strategies out
still
there.
they're
Yeah.
still as efficacious?
Um, I think there's some strategies out there that you may not get the most efficacy if you're cutting back on the mineral or you're changing the load of solids in the formula to make it cosmetically elegant. But overall, if like for like, you can use different materials. We have different formulation chemistries available to us now, and we're always innovating in that space to make them more elegant, right? To make them more
Right.
usable, and the more usable and likable they are, the better results people are going to get.
Of course. And what about really darker skin types? Because a lot of times they have a hard time with. They're the ones who need them the most. Of course, the sunscreens with iron oxides, but sometimes those colors don't quite work on a really dark skin types.
Yeah, they're the least suitable. I mean, all the
Right.
research shows us that, and everybody's eyes can tell them that. And so yeah, that's where a
Exactly.
lot of a lot of the research is also going in terms of the material chemistry and again new formulations to make mineral sunscreens more inclusive and accessible because as we use more and more minerals now, there's more and more interest in mineral formulas due to
Yes.
news, whether that be real or fake. There's still more
Yes.
interest in that part of the category, so those solutions need to be more accessible.
Yeah, and more amenable to large populations. And I do want to talk about the chemical sunscreens and these studies that were done on chemical sunscreens, because of course that's the kind of thing that gets picked up in the news and in social media. It's all over about the absorption of chemical sunscreens. So maybe just how do we deal with that as dermatologists, and maybe give a little bit of the background about those maximal use studies that were done. I mean, those were a lot of sunscreen was put on the patients in those studies.
Yeah, and if Gen Z, if that's their first introduction to what a sunscreen is all about, no wonder they're.
No wonder they're not using them.
But yeah, in terms of where sunscreens are and the regulation and the safety, it's again
Yes.
a fascinating time. Um, the FDA is looking at a way to modernize the approval process for sunscreen and sunscreen ingredients. So from that standpoint, there's still a lot of confusion of how we're interpreting the processes that need to get modernized for people to ultimately do what we want, right? To have better, more modern, more efficacious, and more accessible sunscreens for everybody. But the process to get there is long and complicated and full of maybe less intuitive parts that don't resonate with consumers. So, one of those being the must study or the maximum use trial, where
Mm-hmm.
in essence the design is really easy, right? They want to figure out what's the worst possible scenario of people using these products, which can be chronic products in the sense of like people using
Sure.
sunscreens over their entire lifetime to protect themselves as appropriate. So what's worst possible scenario? Well, it's using it in maximal quantities over and over again throughout a day, but that's certainly not relevant to the way people actually
Actually
do and
use
can
sunscreen.
use the products.
Yeah.
But that's the idea, is to come up with this super exaggerated worst case scenario, and if that once we can prove that's safe, then everything less than that will be also safe.
And then unfortunately, they found that under those maximal use conditions, the sunscreens were absorbed. Many of the UV filters were absorbed. So that kind of threw everything on its head. And then, like, where are we left? How do we talk to patients about that? It's really difficult. I'm not sure what you mean by modernizing the process, because I almost look at it as a physician or clinicians are like, we're going backwards, because now sunscreens that used to be considered grass, generally regarded as safe and effective, are non-grass because the FDA is not happy with the degree of scientific study that we have on those sunscreens. So it makes it more difficult for us to talk to patients, obviously, under these
Yeah.
new scenarios.
Yeah, and I certainly, with the questions we get as well, understand how it's the feeling, right, of going going backwards. And so,
It's,
in my
what's
mind, it's
going
more
on here?
it's more a sense of how we maybe need to tear down the foundation a little bit, right, to rebuild it so it's stronger moving forward. But it certainly causes lots of questions and lots of uncertainty in terms of how these, you know, products with this very, very long, extensive experience with human
Yeah,
use and
we've been
safety
using them for decades.
get tested moving forward, and what's the
Right.
appropriate models. And again, I think there's a fascinating opportunity to modernize in the sense of how we understand clinical toxicology and safety and all of it, but that pathway is extremely hard to navigate, and unfortunately sunscreens will get caught in the crosshairs of the ambiguity of what we need to do
Right.
to be appropriate moving forward. But I do think there'll be a, for lack of a better word, a guinea pig moving forward in terms of what is the right way that we can modernize the process. And hopefully within my lifetime, we'll get to a really good place.
Maybe we'll get a new UV filter approved in the US. It's been decades since we've had anything new come into our marketplace, which is
Yeah.
really challenging. I mean, it's why so many dermatologists go to Europe and bring sunscreens back, because they've got all those great UVA filters there that we just don't have access to. So it's interesting times for sure. There's other things that I think are of interest to dermatologists in terms of protecting the skin, and I think antioxidants is one of those. We all recommend antioxidants for our patients sort of routinely, but sunscreen companies are now putting antioxidants into sunscreens and sun protecting products. So talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really another way to give us sort of like an extra layer of protection.
Yeah. Another, really good question. And for me, that's another fascinating area of research, which will, again, continue to pick up over the next many years, because there's active research still going on now. And like you said, they've become kind of an integral part of sunscreens is to carry antioxidants, because we know, along with, the DNA damage process and the rest of it that underpins the sun's transformation from normal skin to skin cancer, there's a big oxidative stress component. And so whether it's the light itself or other environmental stressors that your skin is faced with during the course of your day, they all do some sort of oxidative stress to the skin. So antioxidants can really help alleviate that. And that's what, studies are routinely showing. And now the question is, what's the right level and type of antioxidant, because there's a plethora of antioxidants out there and they're
Are
not all
there
created
ever?
equal.
No, are there ever? You've got all your vitamin antioxidants, you've got the botanicals. I see a lot of cosmetic companies going in with botanicals.
Hmm.
Vitamin C is one of those fussy molecules. It's not all that much fun to play with, I guess. And so I think the polyphenols and things like that make a lot of sense. Any comments on the oral approaches? Like, we're all using a lot of Helioplex in our practices.
Like the polypodium and those
Polypodium
type of.
leukotomas,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean the evidence suggests that it can also help supplement your oxidative resiliency from within, right? So
yeah.
there's always a good correlative to having a balanced diet and good nutrition to achieving pretty much good health outcomes across the board. And I don't think skin health is any different than that. But overwhelmingly, what we see is, a good diet isn't going to save you from sunburn, though. A good diet isn't going to save you from the
No,
effects of intentional sun exposure or, going out and repeatedly, base tanning to try to give yourself the effect you want of resiliency over the summer. It's not the strategy we would recommend. So I don't think, those things are certainly complementary. I wouldn't necessarily recommend against it, but they're not a replacement for being smart with, sun safe behaviors.
yeah, it's a challenge. And I think we also rely a little bit too heavily on sunscreens. I think we have to also get the message out about sun protective clothing and wearing hats and obviously glasses to protect the eyes, because we do rely heavily on sunscreens. puts a lot of weight on the shoulder of people like you who are developing these products.
Yeah,
And
that's some of the toughest data to deal with, right? Where people would utilize sunscreens to be sun stupid, and that's not the intent
exactly.
of the product. So, and it's also not, you offer more safety options. Those aren't an excuse then to, use your number one safety factor, which is your awareness in your brain, right? So use that, and then all the safety mechanisms will complement that quite nicely.
It's so true. It's a hard thing to teach people, but it's definitely true. Um, Kind of talking a little bit about UVA, because UVA is, I think, one of the places where we have the biggest gap. And as I mentioned, we have so many UVA filters in Europe that we don't have in the US. And I know that you guys have stabilized avobenzone and it's been very effective. So maybe just talking a little bit, I don't think that maybe most dermatologists are aware that many sunscreen filters, the chemical sunscreens, are actually unstable in sunlight. So it requires a little bit of, as I call it, wizardry on the part of formulators to it's sort of counterintuitive because you're dealing with something you want to use to protect, but it also has degradation when it's exposed to light. So maybe just kind of talking through the chemistry there in terms of what's going on with the UV filters.
Yeah, and we ask a lot from sunscreens, right? I mean, it's a
Exactly.
fascinating category because you have a molecule that's going to absorb radiation and then needs to
And go
dissipate that
poof.
energy somehow. Yep. So it
Exactly.
needs to do it right, and then the different chemistries absorb in different places of the spectrum. But so
Right.
avobenzone is one of those. It is our chemical UVA filter right now. It's the one we
Yeah.
have. It's the workhorse for all of
Yeah.
our sunscreen products. But if it's not super happy, it can lose its efficacy over time. So it's important to stabilize it, and you do that, through a few different techniques. But
Mm-hmm.
you can look at it that it's stable, and that's what Helioplex innovation was about. It's about stabilizing avobenzone so that it has a way to remain effective the entire duration of your sun exposure so that you're not losing efficacy over time. So modern sunscreens, certainly Helioplex sunscreens, are meant to be last through your exposure. And then you still have to follow the directions, reapply every 80 minutes, which is really governed
Right.
on best safety practices, right? That in terms of people don't realize if they rub off their sunscreen inadvertently or they towel or they're sweating or they're swimming, really that's where you lose your sunscreen. You rub it off, you remove it on accident.
Oh,
So if
interesting.
you reapply more frequently, in general, you'll miss less spots and you'll be less subject to getting burned in those areas you forgot.
Well, that's interesting. So most of the time the sunscreen's getting rubbed off and I suppose sweated off as well. But a lot of them are sweat resistant and
Yeah.
water resistant.
Well,
Yeah,
and I'll
that
say, like, having a daughter, there's no sunscreen on the planet that can resist her rubbing her eyes or taking her goggles on and off out of the pool.
yeah.
So it's just those high touch areas, those high
The
rub
physical.
areas that that
Interesting.
it's always a challenge, right? So that's where there's plenty of room for innovation.
Absolutely. Let's talk for just 1 second about vitamin D because you made an interesting comment when you and I were talking before, and we were talking about the UVB, which we know is important for the conversion of vitamin D to its active form. And we were saying that's interesting that most of the studies looking at vitamin D for people who use sunscreen like sort of on a regular daily basis don't show that there is vitamin D deficiency in that group of patients. So it's again seems a little bit counterintuitive because you would think that a good UVB filter would block vitamin D synthesis.
Yeah, from the chemistry perspective, it does, right? It prevents those
Yes.
photons that do the same thing from getting to the skin. So if it does that, then it's very reasonable that it would slow down the conversion of vitamin D in the skin. But that's, when you go into the human clinical setting, that's what you see. It slows it down, right? Just like anyone will still get a sunburn if you use too little sunscreen or you stay out there
You
too
stay out
long,
too long.
it's going to be the same for vitamin D. You're going to slow it down. So when you use sunscreen in terms of sun safety, meaning that you're using it to be safer in sun exposure settings, you're still going to get vitamin D. You're still going to get some conversion. You're still going to get the benefits of being active and healthy and outdoor, but
Yeah.
you're going to remove some of the negatives of certainly what we hope for, severe
Sunburn.
sunburn. But over time, that's where the sunscreen benefit really comes in. If you look at vitamin D deficiency in terms of sun avoidance or in terms of sunscreen as a way to, avoid all sun exposure, then yeah, that's where you'll see some potential deficiencies where, again, healthy diet and some other compensation mechanisms
Right.
like supplementation would be most appropriate.
Interesting. So it will, I guess you're right. It's just the filter's only as good as the filter's is. So it won't last forever and won't completely stop the conversion. Yeah, because the data is so interesting when you look at it. Maybe just one final thing, sort of looking on the horizon of sun protection and sun care. What do you see on the horizon? Is there anything super interesting that might become a reality anytime soon?
I'm still fascinated, and still greatly encouraged. I mean, despite the results of the survey saying we got a lot of work to do, it's encouraging that we still have a lot of drive to do that work. It's a fascinating time. I think it's always a fascinating time for sunscreens. It's been evolving. It's going to continue to evolve. We've got new technologies elsewhere in the world that are poised to be ready to be
Yeah,
offered to different
yeah.
markets if we can figure out a way to do it, or when we can figure out a way to do it. I'll say when, not if. It's just a matter of time, in my opinion. And then once that opens, hopefully we have a nice pathway to continued innovation, deeper understanding of how to make sunscreens more enjoyable and easier to use. Because if we can do that, then they're going to be more efficacious.
And more people will use them.
Yep.
It's a big barrier. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I really do appreciate it. I hope everybody has enjoyed this episode. And check us out at scienceofskincaresummit.com. Again, if you're interested in learning more about skincare. Thanks again, Josh. Have a great day.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.